Science and Humanities at Ontario Tech University. And I'll be joined today by several of my colleagues in the faculty who will come at this from their own perspective and offer some views. I'm hoping that we can open it up for discussion shortly after they make brief presentations, and then we can move on to perhaps some Q&A. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the lands that Ontario Tech is located. So we acknowledge the lands of the people of the Mississaugas of the Skulog Island First Nation, which is covered under the Williams Treaties. We are situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. So today we have three, as I mentioned, scholars besides myself that will offer some perspectives, and they come at this from a different angle, each of them. I'll introduce the panel briefly now, but I would like to say, just as a housekeeping measure, if everyone could keep muted during the presentations. And if you're not familiar with the format we're using, at the bottom of your screen, there are various circles. One of them contains a microphone. If you click on that, you'll be muted. If you click on the camera, you'll either show yourself or not. And then on the far side, we have the far right, bottom right, you'll see there's a space for a chat. This is the second icon from the right margin. If you click on that, and we would ask if you have questions you'd like our panelists to address, please put it in the chat. And that way we can manage things, I think, efficiently, because we don't have too much time today, although we're good for, I think, 90 minutes. So briefly, our panelists, very briefly, my name again is Peter Stute. I've been following international relations and teaching international relations for 30 odd years, I would put it that way. And in particular, I've been interested in the environmental impact of military conflict and in international law and international humanitarian law. And I've worked extensively with the United Nations on environmental issues at the global level. Dr. Natalie Ullman is with us today. She is Associate Professor of Legal Studies at Ontario Tech University. She's currently a visiting fellow at the University of Victoria's Center for Global Studies. Her most recent book, The Responsibility to Protect in International Law, outlines the tools international law can offer when the United Nations collective security system fails to address humanitarian crises. Our second speaker will be Dr. Sasha Bagley, who is Associate Professor of Legal Studies at Ontario Tech University, and her areas of expertise include immigration and refugee policy. And then finally, Dr. Scott Aquano will join us as well. Dr. Aquano is Assistant Professor and Program Director of the Political Science Program here at Ontario Tech. His specializations include economic and social policy, international political economy, and finance. So those are very brief introductions. My apologies to my panelists, but we're trying to move right along. So if you'd like to begin, Dr. Ullman, and perhaps give us some perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'd like to begin by myself acknowledging with gratitude and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory I'm now living and working, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wassanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Obviously, because I'm coming at this issue from the perspective of international law, I have a wealth of different options as to what I might focus on in my introductory comments. But I've decided to begin by talking about something that many of us are seeing in media coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that is throwaway statements about how this represents the death knell of international law, or at least the irrelevance of a rule-based international order. And I'd like to suggest to you, and throughout our conversation today, that these events indicate precisely the opposite of this. that the language of international law has been used throughout by the Russian Federation to try to justify and explain its actions in invading Ukraine. But what I think certainly is the case is that these events agonizingly illustrate the urgency of the need for reform of key international legal institutions and procedures. We know that from the beginning, the Russian Federation employed a legal pretext for its invasion. 3 days before the invasion, on February 21st, on behalf of the Russian Federation, President Putin signed a presidential decree purporting to recognize the independence of two breakaway regions that had been engaged in a conflict with the Ukrainian government since the invasion by Russia of Crimea in 2014. Now, it is widely known that these breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk had state-sponsored insurgencies funded and assisted actively by the Russian government. 3 days before the invasion, the Russian government chose to recognize the so-called independence of these breakaway regions and to report that a treaty had been concluded, which provided for the Russian Federation to station troops and weapons on the territory of these eastern administrative regions of Ukraine. Now, the reaction of the international community, I think, is widely known. It was a uniform rejection. No other countries recognized these purportedly independent states except Belarus, the ally of Russia that is in effect ceding part of its sovereignty to Russia by allowing military attacks from its own territory. But among other members of the international community, the uniform response was that these military actions constitute an infringement of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And indeed, the mere recognition of the so-called independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions themselves constitute a violation of international law. So if there's such widespread agreement about the status of these statements and these actions, why isn't the United Nations doing anything about it? Many people ask this question, and it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask because, as many of us will know, the United Nations is a treaty organization that was created at the end of the Second World War with the precise purpose of preventing conflict between states. And so in the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations, we see this commitment to preventing conflict. And the commitment is so strong that one of the first articles of the United Nations Charter actually prohibits the use of aggressive force unilaterally. So in other words, the language of war no longer figures in the Charter. It's the use of force. So all members have to refrain and commit to refraining by becoming parties to the UN Charter from the threat or use of force. And not just against the territorial integrity of a state, but also against its political independence. So this element of the Charter of the United Nations is meant to create a collective security mechanism in which members of the United Nations partially cede one element of their sovereignty to a body of the United Nations called the Security Council. Now, I know I'm telling many of you something that you already know well, but just to remind us all, the United Nations is not a world government. It's a treaty organization in which authority is horizontally shared among members. And it's based on the principle of equality, except for one of its organs, and that organ is the Security Council. The Security Council was created as a kind of Rapid Reaction Steering Committee, and it has one area of special responsibility. And that area of special responsibility is to address threats to international peace and security. Now, when the Security Council and the United Nations itself was created in 1945, people didn't know that the Cold War was about to break out. It wasn't clear how ineffectual a Security Council divided by Cold War ideological divisions would become. But the reason that different political orientations and geopolitical aspirations have come to mean so much is that there's the structure of the Security Council itself creates an enormous potential for paralysis. And that structure is based on the idea that the victors of the Second World War, the countries that were referred to as the Allies, demanded as a price of their participation that they be assigned permanent membership to the Security Council. So 5 seats in the Security Council are permanently assigned to 5 states. And those states are United Kingdom, United Kingdom, France, the Russian Federation, China, and the United States. The names of the entities that occupy those seats have changed as geopolitical reality has changed. But those 5 countries have permanently sat in the Security Council since the UN was created. And each of them doesn't just possess a permanent seat, it also possesses a veto. So for any resolution on any matter, but specifically on threats to international peace and security, for any resolution on this subject matter to pass, it requires 9 of 15 votes, but any one of the permanent members can exercise a veto and prevent the resolution from passing. And that's what happened on February 25th, I think, when the first resolution condemning Russia and requiring it to withdraw from Ukrainian territory came to the floor of the Security Council. We all know 11 members of the Security Council voted in favor, 3 abstained. Well, if 11 of 15 voted in favor, it should have passed, but no, because Russia possesses one of those golden vetoes. And so the resolution failed. So I'm thinking about how much time I've been speaking. I think I've been speaking at length. So let me leave you with 2 more thoughts. One is that there are a number of key terms in international law that are being freely used in the media. Concepts like genocide, combatant, recognition, war crime are appearing frequently. And it's one of the things I hope will come out in the discussion is that everyday use of those terms does not correspond to the technical use in international law of those terms. And a lot of confusion, I think, can arise when those terms, when the technical use and the everyday language use are confused. So let me end my comments there and hope to engage with my colleagues and with the audience in the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. And some of you might have watched the Security Council earlier today where Russia took advantage of this position and made a speech about biological weapons in Ukraine. I hesitate to even mention that because I don't want to add to the disinformation campaign that's obviously a part of, but it is an example of, as Natalie was indicating, how the Security Council is skewed basically in favor of the so-called great powers and the nuclear powers in this sense. Okay, Dr. Begley, would you like to proceed, please?
Yes, sure, thank you. Since my expertise is in the area of refugee law, I will very briefly speak about issues related to displacement, and I have a couple of slides to share. So just please let me know if you can see them, okay? I hope yes. So since we only have 10 minutes, I will be very brief, but I'm happy to address further questions in the discussion. So the 3 things that I will touch upon are just a little bit of the framework of what refugee protection is about and some definitions. And this point actually connects, I think, very well to what Natalie has just said, that our day-to-day understanding of who a refugee is may be quite different, or at least in some ways different, to how it is actually defined in international law. The second point I will discuss is very briefly what has been the international response, particularly of the neighboring states, of the European Union, of the US, Canada, to displacement from Ukraine. And finally, we'll highlight something that you probably have already seen in the news, the differences in responses that we observe. So, for example, quite a stark contrast to response to displacement from Ukraine compared to, for example, displacement from Syria or from some other countries. So when we think about people who are fleeing for their lives, essentially, the international law does address those situations. And also most countries in the world have a specially set up refugee determination system to respond to such situations. And when we say refugee, according to the international law definition, particularly the Refugee Convention, it refers not just to anybody who generally flees a risk to their life, but actually it's much narrower. So the person has to show that they face persecution on the basis of one of the 5 grounds that you can see here on the slide. There is also an additional regime that stems from international human rights law, particularly the Convention Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that also allows grant of protection on the basis of risk to life and risk of torture. And the definition of those risks is somewhat varies based on the jurisdiction. So, for example, in Canadian context, risk to life would not necessarily, this ground would not necessarily embrace everybody fleeing from a war situation, because according to our definition, you have to show that you face some sort of individualized risk that is not necessarily faced by others.
Sasha, I'm sorry, but the slides haven't moved.
The slides haven't moved. I am on the second slide. Okay, can you
go? That's good.
Yeah, I guess like when I do the full presentation, then for some reason.
That's okay.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you.
So these are the definitions that I've been talking about. So if essentially, in order for a person to access refugee protection, they typically, so whether it's under the Refugee Convention or this subsidiary complementary regime, they have to flee their country, enter another state, and make a refugee claim there. And usually then every country will have a special process for determining that claim. That is often relatively lengthy, involves a particular process of a hearing. Obviously, the claimant has to substantiate their claim. So when we see sudden influx of a large number of people, this creates major concerns about such systems being overwhelmed, and then individuals waiting for years to have a decision on their claim. Partially to respond to such situations, particularly in the European Union, but this is not really the case, for example, for Canada or the US, there's a special temporary protection directive that is specifically designed to address mass influx of displaced individuals to European Union. This directive was adopted after the war in Yugoslavia, so this was one of the major waves of asylum seekers in Europe. And it was supposed to be sort of this pragmatic solution, in a sense that since obviously we will not be able to adjudicate speedily all individual claims, then we will sort of allow people some temporary status en masse. So essentially through a simplified process, but it will only be temporary protection. So usually a duration of 1 year, potentially a little bit longer, with access to certain welfare supports, education, employment, but at the same time, temporary status in the country. This is in contrast to refugee protection that usually, at least again, according to the majority of jurisdictions, does lead to permanent protection. So even though there are some benefits to this temporary protection directive, it does not provide a longer-term solution. In relation to the situation in Ukraine, what we see is that in the span of 2 weeks, there have already been 2.5 million people who have fled abroad, and 1 million, this is the estimate, probably quite a conservative one, have been internally displaced, primarily those who moved to the western part of the country. And the projections are that obviously these numbers are going to grow. This is just a quick picture of where some of them, especially in terms of movement abroad, where some of the major movements have occurred. So Poland has been one of the largest recipients so far with about 1.5 million. But of course, it doesn't mean that all individuals will stay in the first countries that they have entered. So they likely will move further within the European Union as well. So the response so far that we have seen, and again here obviously I'm just highlighting a couple of jurisdictions, has been mostly in terms of this temporary protection. So individuals who are fleeing from Ukraine, of course, can either benefit from refugee protection, so then they will have to make an asylum claim and wait for it to be processed, or they can take advantage of these temporary protection regimes. And we have seen that at least 3 jurisdictions have largely adopted this. At least their idea is that the primary response, the quickest response, will be through these temporary protection solutions. The European Union has, for the first time since 2001, has invoked this temporary protection directive. And according to this directive, anybody who is fleeing from Ukraine, who is either a Ukrainian national or a national of a third country, but who enjoyed legal status, long-term status in Ukraine, or refugee status in Ukraine, can apply and receive through a simplified process this temporary protection. So the effect of that protection will be that they will be able to reside in a country of European Union for the next year. It's possible if the situation persists, then the status can be extended for periods of 6 months at a time, potentially to the longest of 3 years. So, and the immediate benefit is that because they receive this temporary resident status, they obviously do not face any risks of being removed back to Ukraine, for instance. They also can start working. They will get access to education and to basic supports. However, the downside of that, of course, is that there is no certainty in longer term future, whether they will be able to stay permanently. In contrast, if somebody applied for refugee protection, there is, if they're successful in their claim, if they meet one of the definitions that I mentioned earlier, they are more likely to receive permanent protection. However, that process is much more complex and lengthy. We also have seen that the US has announced the special temporary protected status also very quickly. So all of these measures have been announced within the first week of Russian invasion, where Ukrainian nationals who entered the United States prior to March 1st can now apply and receive this temporary protected status up to 18 months. So again, the requirements are relatively minimal as long as you have entered the United States before March 1st and you are not criminally inadmissible, then this likely will entitle the person to receive that protected status. Canada has only announced its intention to introduce this emergency travel authorization program, so we don't know the details yet. But so far, the statement suggests that they will be for Ukrainian nationals only. So third country nationals, even if they had permanent status in Ukraine, would not be able to benefit from this program. And that once these individuals arrive to Canada, essentially, there will be no visa requirement to arrive and supposedly speedy processing. They can remain here for up to 2 years on a temporary status. They will also have an access to a work permit, potentially some supports, but that has not been clearly announced yet. And there is no limit on the number of people who can arrive. If anybody who benefits from any of these temporary protected status programs, obviously can also consider another route of applying for refugee protection. But there, it's very likely that there will be certain barriers to recognition as a refugee or as a person in need of protection, because the definitions are relatively narrow. I don't have time at this moment to go into those details, but I will be happy to explain a little bit later on. So for now, it seems like the best, quickest, and easiest solution. And it's also, of course, very pragmatic, keeping in mind the large numbers of individuals that are arriving, especially to the European Union. So this gives a quick response without overwhelming domestic asylum systems. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the downside for applicants is that there is no certainty beyond these announced timelines. So how, if somebody wishes to remain, it's not known how they will be able to transition in those host countries to some sort of permanent status. And finally, the last point is to put this response, extremely welcoming, extremely rapid response to Ukrainian displacement, in contrast to other more typical, if you will, responses to refugees. I have here on the slide just a couple of examples, but generally speaking, for example, when we think about responses to refugees in Europe, Europe is usually characterized as Fortress Europe. And one of the most vivid examples perhaps was in 2015, that was actually dubbed the Refugee Crisis. This is at the time when, during the span of 2015, some 1.3 million asylum seekers arrived in the European Union, and the majority of them were Syrians, Afghans, or Iraqis. And this has provoked initially relatively positive response, but as the numbers have been increasing, then there was a very strong development of xenophobic rhetoric, especially in Central European countries. For instance, Hungary closed its borders. It refused to allow particularly Syrian refugees, claiming that they were extremely different, they could not be integrated. We've seen Slovakia similarly saying that they will only take Syrians or Christians because persons of other religions they could not sort of successfully integrate. We've seen also in Poland a very strong political discourse, again emphasizing the differences between Europeans and this cohort of refugees that is arriving. And the contrast is particularly stark, keeping in mind that right now, these same Central European countries, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, are extremely welcoming to Ukrainians. And there is, again, in terms of rhetoric, there is actually emphasis on how similar they are, how easily they will integrate. And also some sort of historic ties are being emphasized as well. So in relation to non-European refugees, there was very strong rhetoric of othering. In contrast, in relation to Ukrainians, the commonality is emphasized, and they're truly welcome. The response has been extraordinary, including from communities. What is also interesting is that 2015 situation was dubbed a crisis, even though the arrival of 1.3 million happened in the span of a whole year. Now we've seen in the span of 2 weeks, 2.5 million arriving. And so far, it has not really been the crisis in the same way and was the same sort of threat and havoc as was used in 2015. Also, what's very interesting is, again, given that there were very strong preconditions in 2015 to use the Temporary Protection Directive to give this quick response to asylum seekers, to give them that temporary status and access to some basic supports, it was not activated. Yet, in case of Ukraine, the temporary directive was activated within a matter of a week, so extraordinarily fast. We also have seen that the European Union generally found it quite difficult to sort of find states that were willing to admit Syrian or Afghan or Iraqi refugees. They also have concluded a special agreement with Turkey to increase border controls, to prevent individuals from traveling between Turkey and Greek border, to turn people back from Greece to Turkey. So again, it really reinforced most of this idea of Fortress of Europe in a range of ways, including in terms of how a good or sort of integratable refugee is being constructed. Canada, although generally is considered to be much more welcoming to refugees, also has quite a different response, I think, to Ukrainian versus Syrian or Afghan displacement. So again, this new program, that the details of which have not been announced yet, convey the idea that admission will be relatively flexible, even though it's temporary protection, but it's supposed to be very quick. The requirements will be minimal. People will be able to travel here quite freely and easily. Yet in response, and there will be no cap on the number of individuals who can come. In contrast, the response to Syrian and Afghan refugees has been through resettlement. So this is a very different process that is much lengthier. And usually the person cannot get approved for resettlement unless they're sponsored by Canadian government or a private sponsor in Canada. Those may be very difficult to come along. So, and the process itself also, all of the processing typically is conducted outside of Canada. So the person may still be in the situation of danger, waiting for their case to be decided. And this is a stark contrast to this emergency travel authorization, where a Ukrainian supposedly will be able to quickly travel to Canada for safety. There are also, in cases of resettlement, admission targets. So there were very specific numbers, a number of spots that were allocated for Syrian or Afghan refugees. There is no cap for Ukrainians that will come under that temporary program. Another very quick example, we probably all know about the crisis in Venezuela. In fact, actually, a few months ago, the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court has started an investigation about crimes against humanity committed by the regime. So clearly the situation is extremely grave. Yet Canada has never announced any special programs. It only deferred removals of Venezuelans back to Venezuela, but other than that, there was no any particular extraordinary response, despite the fact that already for a couple of years, Venezuela was the second largest source country for refugees in the world. And finally, very last point, even in the situation of war in Ukraine, when everybody is at risk, regardless, obviously, of whether they're Ukrainian national or not, there are multiple reports where individuals of color are being discriminated at, both, unfortunately, by Ukrainian authorities in evacuation, so even sort of the ability to get on a train or bus, and also at border crossings. They often wait much longer, allowing European sort of white refugees to pass. So there clearly has been very significant contrast in how both Ukrainian and also authorities of other countries are perceiving who deserves protection in the first place. And I'll stop here, and I'm happy to address any other questions later on in the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. I think we'll continue, and then we'll come back to the questions. I see we have some forming in the chat, so I'm hoping others in our audience will think of questions they'd like answered. But it is, of course, hard to fathom 2 million people fleeing at once, and I don't think we've seen anything like this in Europe. Pardon me. I know it has occurred elsewhere, of course, although even then, this number and the time frame involved is truly staggering. So, Dr. O'Connell, would you like to proceed?
Thanks, Peter. So I'm going to focus on a bit of a different dimension of the conflict, given my background in international finance and international political economy, and look at least briefly at how the war is being fought through economic power and economic coercion. How, in other words, Western financial primacy has kind of been overtly weaponized in this conflict, the use of sanctions on the Russian regime, which is unambiguously at fault for this conflict. Despite the fact that Western countries have acted to arm Ukraine, it is through sanctions that the West has primarily intervened in the conflict, as we know. So I just want to spend a few minutes perhaps looking at the recent history of economic sanctions, as and I'll cut my historical analysis to the kind of post 1991 period, and look briefly at how sanctions have been used to meet multilateral and geopolitical objectives. And then I'll spend a few minutes overviewing the sanctions regime that has been imposed on Russia now. And if I have time, perhaps I'll take a few minutes to briefly comment on the political and perhaps social impacts of the sanctions regime, although there are, of course, many, and maybe I'll leave most of those comments to the question and answer period. So first, on kind of the history of sanctions, the brief history of sanctions and what they aim to do and how they actually occur. So sanctions are, of course, not new. They have been used repeatedly to shape foreign politics. This is precisely because sanctions support on-the-ground military operations, and even more importantly, because they are an effective and often seen to be legitimate alternative to kinetic military intervention. So sanctions briefly are just a form of soft power that produce coercive pressure on the sanctioned state by defining the economic playing field. In many ways, sanctions have been the kind of the weapon of choice for the U.S. in the post-Cold War period. Though, as we know, there was a massive increase of troops on the ground, U.S. troops on the ground, from the 1990s following the first Iraq War through the mid-2000s. The U.S.'s capacity to use sanctions critically as an effective tool of intervention stems at base from the very organization of the global economy. US firms are today often at the very center of global supply chains, and even more importantly, the US dollar and US financial firms are nothing short of the central nervous system of the global economy. Trade, for example, occurs through US banks and US bank intermediaries, and US correspondent banks are the holders and the securities dealers of the for the rest of the world. Accessing finance, accessing foreign exchange markets, accessing trade finance, etc., requires going through US financial intermediaries. And it requires going through US dollar markets, which are controlled by US financial intermediaries. From Bush to Obama to Trump, then, sanctions have been increasingly used to unilaterally, in fact, isolate countries from trade and financial engagement. It's become a new form of statecraft, especially following 1991. Sanctions have, in fact, become an unquestioned article of faith across the US political spectrum. And they're seen to be the preferred tool for foreign policy. Coercion through the threat of economic collapse has been, in other words, the primary tool of US geopolitical rule since the 1990s. Moreover, and very importantly, and this is something that distinguishes the present from the past, the US has increasingly resorted to the use of secondary sanctions, whereby third-party foreign states and companies that do business with the country that's being sanctioned are also targeted, typically, again, by denying these companies and states access to US financial markets and thus provoking financial ruin. Secondary sanctions, therefore, pressure US allies to fall in line with US preferences or risk being severed from the US-based global financial system, which, as I mentioned, is also the lifeblood of the globalized trade system. So the use of primary and in particular secondary sanctions and the increased use of these sanctions is one of the defining features of geopolitics following the collapse of the USSR, and the US has been at the forefront of this. The sanctions imposed on Russia today, in some senses, rival those applied to Iraq in the 1990s and to Iran today. And the very effectiveness of the present sanctions, and we can get to this in question period more so, are in fact a product of the institutional capacity and knowledge that has been developed as a result of the use of primary and secondary sanctions in the post-1991 period. Western governments had to learn how to effectively govern and apply sanctions in a digitalized, globalized financial economy. And essentially through 20 years or 30 years of institutional learning, they have in good part perfected the use of sanctions, and sanctions as a result today are incredibly effective and incredibly crippling. And we'll get to that point in a second. But of course, the sanctions that imposed on Russia today are also very different. And they're different kind of for two reasons. First, they are obviously not being imposed by the US unilaterally. In fact, some would argue that the most significant sanctions being imposed on Russia today are from Switzerland, although it's far from clear that those sanctions are more significant than the sanctions that have been imposed by the US. Nonetheless, these are hardly unilateral actions. And secondly, what distinguishes today's sanction regime from previous sanctions regimes is that the sanctions being imposed on Russia are not being imposed in the dark. The very explicit and the very public aim of these sanctions is to collapse the Russian economy. In the past, sanctions have usually been applied not in the public light, and thus the effects are difficult to understand politically. So with that background, I just want to spend now a few moments looking at the current sanctions imposed on Russia, so that we can begin perhaps to think through and talk about the implications of all this. The sanctions imposed on Russia today following the invasion are, by all standards, by all measures, comprehensive and mutually reinforcing. The sanctions target Russia's central bank, its private banks, and its trade in strategic goods. And in addition, the sanctions target the assets of key political and economic actors. By my count, there have been about 3,000 separate sanctions imposed on Russia since the start of the war a few weeks ago. Overall, Russia suffers now under the weight of about 5,500 sanctions. Many of those sanctions were applied after 2004 in response to the annexation of Crimea, but the nature and the magnitude of the sanctions have been greatly enhanced following the present invasion. Just by reference, Iran, which kind of is under the most comprehensive sanctions regime presently, faces about 3,600 sanctions. So Russia is by far the most sanctioned state in the world today, and the implications of this will be profound, both geopolitically and for Russia. And sadly, I think the effect of these sanctions will be indiscriminate insofar as they will be borne in large part by the Russian people. But we could, of course, deal with those issues in discussion. So the most significant sanctions that have been imposed are the sanctions on the Russian central bank and its private financial institutions. The Russian central bank is kind of the lender of last resort to Russian commercial banks, and is the kind of the lender of last resort to the ruble in foreign exchange markets. So it plays a critical role in the Russian economy. And in fact, one might argue that Putin saw the buildup of foreign exchange reserves that had occurred after 2014 as a key measure insulating him from Western sanctions. But of course, this has not been the case. On the eve of the crisis, the Russian central bank had about $650 billion in foreign exchange assets. This is a massive number. Of course, it's nothing in comparison to the over $3 trillion the Chinese state has, but it's nonetheless a very significant number. This $650 billion can be put to work in foreign exchange markets to support the ruble, but it also critically is used and can be used to support the stability of the Russian banking system, because Russian financial institutions have claims in non-Russian currency. When the sanctions were imposed on the Russian central bank, 60%, almost $400 billion of these foreign exchange reserves were immediately frozen and thus inaccessible to the Russian central bank. Moreover, and almost as importantly, the remaining 40%, though they weren't technically frozen, were all but unavailable to Russia, because sanctions put limitations on dealing, or prohibited rather, any financial institution from dealing with the Russian central bank. So Russia still maintained a good stockpile of gold. It still maintained a reasonable stockpile of other currencies, but it couldn't use those because foreign financial institutions were prohibited from dealing with Russia. And of course, foreign exchange markets are in Western markets, and the Russian central bank was barred from those. So the sanctions are in many respects unprecedented. Never before have we seen a sanctions regime of this nature put on a G8 or G20 central bank, and certainly not a nuclear power. So these sanctions will make it really impossible for the Russian central bank to adequately intervene in the economy to protect the Russian economy and the Russian banking system. And the effect of this will be, in combination with the other sanctions that are imposed, some degree of financial ruin that will ultimately rebound on one would think, Putin. The actions that have been taken against Russian private banks are also critically important. And essentially, these sanctions have been about severing Russian banks from the global financial system and undermining the ability of these banks to operate outside of Russia. The action against private banks has occurred primarily through two mechanisms. First, Russian banks have been prevented from dealing in what's called the SWIFT communication system. Like the SWIFT is kind of an interbank communication system that allows banks to rapidly communicate with one another and exchange currencies or assets or deposits. Russian banks are no longer allowed to participate in the SWIFT system. This is very important, but it doesn't mean, of course, they can't transact with other banks through more old-fashioned measures. And so the second way in which Russian private banks have been impacted is they have been excluded from operating with correspondent banks, which means that Western financial institutions are prohibited from dealing with many Russian banks, policy banks, industrial banks, and state banks. They cannot deal in Russian assets, they cannot hold their deposits, and they cannot execute financial actions or financial transactions from these institutions. So what this does is essentially cut Russian banks off from the international financial system. And the most notable example of this was the severing of the sanctions imposed on Russia's largest bank, Sberbank, which about half of all Russian households have an account in. This bank has now been excluded from the financial system. Now, the overall implications of this are kind of difficult to understand, but these actions, at the very least, freeze about $500 billion of assets in Russian banks, and will, as they continue, cripple these banks, preventing them not only from participating in Western financial markets, but functioning at all, because they have enormous liabilities in foreign currency, which will be defaulted on because they are unable to access foreign currency and unable to trade in the assets they do have. So the result of these public and private financial sections is essentially to close Russia's current and capital accounts off, to close the Russian financial and economic system from the global financial and trading system. These will put pressure on Russian currency, will prevent borrowing in financial markets, will lead Russia to default on its debt, and will eventually collapse the Russian banking system. They will also very importantly undermine Russia's ability to produce complex goods, right? It will, in essence, sever Russia from international supply chains, because they will not be able to access the component parts to build cars, planes, and other complicated goods. Russia relies enormously on technological inputs, which are funneled through the global banking system, and without access to the banking system, it will not be able to access the trading system, and this will eventually grind Russia's economy to a halt. So these sanctions are very significant and very unprecedented, and will have an enormous impact on Russia, not just in the medium term, but certainly also in the long term. Once sanctions are imposed, they tend not to be removed quickly. Now, the one notable exception to the sanctions so far, which we might want to talk about a little bit, of course, is oil. And that's, of course, not an insignificant exception to the sanctions. But perhaps I'll leave it there and note that if anyone has any questions on the impact of this for Russia, for the global economy, or for the war, we can perhaps deal with that in the question period. So I'll hand it back over to Peter, and thank you very much all for your time.
Thanks, Scott. I'll be shorter. Just briefly discuss some of the environmental implications here. I would also remind our viewers, if you have a question, please put it in the chat space. I see there are some good questions already, and we'll get a start on that soon. As with any other conflict, it will be some time before we're fully aware of the environmental impact that's taking place. And however, we do have certain advantages today when we're watching this horror unfold to be able to get a good sense of what's going on. One of the main concerns, of course, are with the nuclear power plants. Ukraine has 15 active nuclear reactors. We've seen at least one of them come under pretty severe fire, actually, and in fact, the fire was started near it. Fire was under control. However, in the case of what we might call occupied nuclear power plants, imagine that phraseology that we're using today, there are concerns about whether or not the staff is being adequately treated and whether or not they're able to efficiently run the nuclear power plants. And Ukraine is heavily, of course, dependent on nuclear power. And so this is something new that we're really seeing. Very little data is coming out of the plants, including Chernobyl, actually, which of course was the site of the greatest nuclear disaster we've seen in 1986. What many people don't realize is that near Chernobyl is the Red Forest, and there was a massive forest fire there back in 1992. Some of that has been burning as well already, and we are dealing with this in an era of climate change when forests are typically drier in that region and more likely to begin forest fires. So we're not too sure about what sort of damage the military occupation of Chernobyl in particular has, but there's little doubt that some radioactive ash, for example, that resulted from the fire in 1992 has probably hit the atmosphere. In addition to that, there are very serious concerns about such a heavily industrialized country. Anytime we saw this in Serbia, we've seen this elsewhere. We saw this, of course, in the oil-producing regions, such as Iraq, when the U.S. invaded there. I think the gas pipelines are concerns in terms of rupturing storage facilities, hydroelectric dams. These are all concerns. There are also concerns about depleted uranium munitions. Russian army has not been open about whether or not it's using depleted uranium, but there are many people assume that they are. It's an effective military approach, but it's bad for the environment in the long term. There's also a massive biosphere preserve in Ukraine, the Black Sea Biosphere Preserve, which is a Ramsar protected site, a wetland. Wetlands are the most crucial ecosystems we have in many senses. And we're seeing fires already from that area. In fact, fires have been visible from space satellites in that area where there are many endangered species as well. So these are all very serious concerns. I was one of the people who signed a letter from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, which has been sent around now. And I can certainly direct people to it. There's also what I would call spin-off concerns, so that are major. Beyond what we've heard about today, right? So yeah, I don't know, Scott, what it's going to look like to see a major economy actually, because of punitive sanctions collapse. That's going to be very fascinating, I think, to watch unfold, and very hard on the Russian people, obviously. But there's also repercussions for the rest of the world. I think Sasha touched on some of them by suggesting, that other situations are receiving less attention because of this, and yet we still do have very serious humanitarian crises, particularly in Yemen and in Syria. Still, I could go on, Democratic Republic of Congo and Venezuela and so forth. And Afghanistan, of course, right, where there's a massive threat right now of famine. The Ukraine and Russia between them provide about a quarter of the world's wheat. So as wheat prices are being driven up and in coincident with inflation that which is taking place before all this occurred. For now, anyways, obviously we're not looking at Ukrainian food exports going out around the world, and that will have repercussions perhaps when it comes to dealing with the world community's ability to intervene in humanitarian disaster cases and provide much needed food. So disruptions to wheat supplies, just as big an issue arguably as disruptions to oil, although of course it's the oil prices that everyone's talking about. The Ukraine also has a massive reserve, around 500,000 tons of lithium oxide. And this is a major component that's being used in the production of electric vehicles today. So many people were hoping that we would move towards electric vehicles away from fossil fuel combustion engines, based partially at least on the affordability of lithium oxide, nickel, and other minerals, which are in fact quite plentiful in Ukraine. So there's obviously been a disruption there too in terms of getting those necessary components, largely for battery production. I think it's difficult to say right now what the long-term impact will be regarding the oil situation. Some are looking at this as, well, as tragic as this is, there's a silver lining, which is that this will prompt the European Union to finally, achieve some sort of energy independence. And in doing so, hopefully, further motivate them to pursue renewable energy. And there's no question, Europeans are talking that way already. I mean, they pledged to be independent completely of Russian fossil fuels before 2030. And there is, of course, call for sinking quite a bit of additional capital in addition to what the European Union has already done. On the other hand, yes, this will also drive the price up, which could make it more attractive to open new oil fields, and eventually the pressure to increase production, no doubt, will be felt. This is an opportunity, some would argue, for some countries such as Canada, to increase exports, and that, to those of us concerned about climate change, is not good news. But I realize, of course, there are differing opinions on that. So these are just, I'm just basically touching the surface here. Again, long term, we have to keep an eye on these things, but short term as well. We did talk a bit about, I think someone mentioned the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court does have jurisdiction over environmental crime, but it's very limited. Basically, the International Criminal Court, and they are right now looking at war crimes that are taking place in this area. But they basically have jurisdiction over genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and the crime of aggression, but only in the latter case, the crime of aggression, if both the invading and the victim country are signatories to the Rome Statute, which is how the International Criminal Court was formed. In this case, that's not the issue. Neither Ukraine nor Russia are bona fide signatories to the Rome Statute. However, Ukraine has agreed on International Criminal Court jurisdiction. They did this back in 2013. So it's this nebulous sort of, and Dr. Roman can elaborate on this perhaps a bit, but this nebulous area in international law where you're a member and you're not. But that being said, there have been some calls to establish a separate tribunal that would look at the crime of aggression. And obviously you'd be looking, in the case of the International Criminal Court, which deals with individuals, that would go right to the top. And it could be Vladimir Putin, what we're talking about. But for the environment, really, it's only the International Criminal Court, as I said, has very limited jurisdiction there. It can charge a state with, an individual who's ordered ecocide as a war crime, only if it can be established that there's widespread, long-term, and severe damage. That's the exact phraseology that's used. And the environmental damage has to be disproportionate to the military need. So, and this is based on another treaty on environmental modification and warfare, and so on. So it's complex. There's no immediate recourse in other words, to try and stop a war because the environment's being damaged. That's for sure. It's an afterthought at best, unfortunately, and I'll leave it there for now. So, okay, why don't we turn to some questions then? We're getting quite a few in the chat, so I'm going to start back at the top, and I'll try and be as quick as I can on this. We had a question which I think would go to Dr. Bagley, which is, does non-Ukrainian nationals legally residing in Ukraine, does that mean foreigners residing in Ukraine at the time of invasion by Russia? If yes, why do you think US and Canada are not welcoming them, but the European Union is? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So, okay. So first of all, again, because of very, limited time, I couldn't go through all the details, but essentially, temporary protection can be granted to non-Ukrainian nationals who are permanently legally residing in Canada or who have refugee status there. Everybody else who has a more temporary status, in a sense, for example, like a student, will not necessarily fall within that temporary protection measure. In order to do so, they also have to show that they do not have safe and durable solution in their home country. Because so the essential idea is that if you're not a Ukrainian national, you're a national of some other country. And the basic presumption is that your own country can't protect you. So it's only if it can't, then somebody else, some other state will step in. So that's this is the limitation. Why US and Canada so far? Again, for Canada, we only have these messages, like maybe somehow they will modify the requirements. So far, what has been announced, it will be for Ukrainian nationals. So the logic here, I think, is, first of all, states are never really very willing to admit people at risk. So they always try to find a way to limit the access criteria. But also there is, again, this underlying consideration that if you're not a Ukrainian national, you're a national of some other country. So the presumption will be you will go there. And also if, for example, Canada and US had the same criterion that, well, maybe you can benefit from the measures that we have introduced if you show that you don't have safe and durable solution in your own country, it probably will overcomplicate the processing because that involves an additional step. And the idea here behind at least US and Canadian programs is to provide very quick access. So I think it's also a bit of this kind of pragmatic streamlining that it will be only for Ukrainian nationals because they definitely don't have any other state to turn to. So that's my quick response because I know there are also a lot of other questions.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you for that clarification. For Natalie, we do know that Russia has left the Council of Europe, largely to avoid getting kicked out because that was the writing was on the wall. But anyways, effectively declaring that it will not abide by the War Crimes Tribunal eventual decision. What recourse does the international community have to not only condemn but effectively punish war crimes in your views?
Thanks for that question. That's a great question. There are a number of different mechanisms that international law possesses to investigate and punish crimes associated with military conflict. So one of them is the International Criminal Court. And the European Council is a body, an international organization that was created to promote human rights and democracy. But it has a court associated with it, the European Court on Human Rights, that decides cases in accordance with the European Convention on Human Rights. Russia's withdrawal from the Council of Europe means that it can't be subject to the jurisdiction of that court. But it doesn't mean that there aren't these other resources. So the International Criminal Court was created in the ruins of the former Yugoslavia after a series of one-off tribunals was created to deal with the genocide in Rwanda, in the war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide that occurred in the former Yugoslavia. And there were a series of these courts. And finally, the international community gained the will and the consensus to create the International Criminal Court. So as Dr. Stutz said, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and then with a little asterisk, the crime of aggression. So although Russia and Ukraine are not parties to that treaty, again, as Dr. Stute said, Ukraine accepted the jurisdiction of the court in 2013. And so I think it was 2014, but at any rate, Ukraine's acceptance of jurisdiction means that war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide that may occur on the terrain of the state of Ukraine can be investigated and prosecuted by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. So the prosecutor has a team in the country now, after having had a request from 39 individual states for the opening of an investigation. And that investigation will look into any allegations and any evidence that suggests that war crimes have occurred. And I just would caution, I don't mean to dominate this discussion, but war crimes encompass a very broad varieties of violations of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. And we can, if people want to pursue this in later questions, we can talk about some of the acts that might constitute war crimes, potentially from both sides in this conflict.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Someone did ask later if a diplomat could be charged under the ICC, and yeah, if they're a member of a government, yeah, they definitely can. So quick answer to that one. Scott, a question for you. How much of an impact do you think there will be in terms of suddenly losing the Western lifestyle choices made by the young population in Russia? Common theme. And by the way, one thing we haven't talked about today, but I want to put this out there very quickly, the human rights situation in Russia, something to really keep an eye on. Just I mean, not surprisingly, but tremendous shift that's taking place there in terms of the brutality of the oppression, I think, of free speech in Russia. But anyways, sorry, Scott, in terms of, will the sanctions have an impact on how the young people think and vote with their feet, I guess?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So I think, yes, the sanctions will have an impact. It's very difficult to judge how popular this war is in Russia. On the one hand, the Russian polls suggest that it's relatively popular, but those are, of course, as we know, meaningless. And it's what makes it very difficult to judge is that protests in Russia are illegal. And in fact, the very fact that we are seeing protests with protesters threatened with crimes such as treason is, I think, an indication that the war is, in fact, very unpopular with the population. The sanctions will, of course, impact people enormously. And you do have, of course, private sanctions occurring with the pullout of firms like McDonald's and Starbucks and these, iconic corporations. But I think overall, the sanctions will be most keenly felt on the populace. And I think that will have an impact, certainly, on the legitimacy of the Putin regime. But we have to remember that by all accounts, it's hardly a legitimate regime right now. That power is extremely concentrated within a small inner circle that includes, of course, Putin, but a small group of economic elite. And I think the really important question that we have to think about is the extent to which the sanctions will impact that alignment of power. I mean, Putin has been able to stay in power so long because he's capable of balancing between these different kind of groups of economic power within Russia. And if the sanctions have a deep material impact on those economic elite, there could be a divergence between the political leadership on the one hand and the economic leadership on the other hand, and that could destabilize the Putin government. So I think we're looking at two different impacts. I think there could be a further delegitimation of the Russian government, of the Putin regime inside Russia, as people suffer under the weight of these sanctions, not only now, but more importantly in the years to come, perhaps, or the months to come. And I said, so that's one side of it. And the other side of it is within the power bloc itself and the extent to which the sanctions, disorient that relatively cohesive bloc as a result of the punishing impact the sanctions will have on Russia's economic elite. I will say this, though. I think even though the sanctions will have a crippling effect on the Russian economy, the economic pie in Russia will, as some people note, continue to be quite large, right? If only because it's very difficult for Europe to divert from their dependence on Russian energy in the short term. And then the extent to which Putin has the capacity to distribute that pie and to allocate economic gains to his inner circle will really, I think, impact his capacity to maintain power and control in Russia. Really excellent question. I myself am not a Russia expert, but those are my 2 cents, and I hope that helps in some way.
Yeah, thanks. And I can't help but think a lot will depend on the length of the military conflict as well. I mean, if it was over pretty shortly, even in conjunction with some sanctions, I think the impact would have been pretty limited. But if it drags on, and it looks like it will, given the courage and determination of the Ukrainian people, as well as whatever help they're getting, I think this will be quite different in terms of the impact of the sanctions as well on civil society, right, within Russia. Sasha, there's another question for you regarding right-wing parties in Europe, which I think you made some allusion to earlier, talking about legitimate migrants versus illegitimate ones. Should this not be addressed at the various government levels, and that a common policy should be declared for all migrants? I suppose the question is referring to within the European Union or perhaps internationally.
Well, it's a very compound question. So I think, perhaps what it's getting at. Well, first of all, despite the discourse on emphasis on migrants' rights and this the importance of ensuring that people can move, especially in cases where they're whether fleeing dangerous situations or just poverty. In reality, states are still acting, whether we're talking about sort of entity like European Union or individual states, they're still acting on the presumption that we as a state, because of our sovereignty, have the right to decide who we admit and who we don't. So, and also foreign nationals are treated as not having a right to admission. So it's really a discretionary decision on the part of the state, recipient state. In that context, there is one of the discourses is that if you migrate through legitimate means, such as if there's certain immigration or refugee programs and you follow that route, meet the criteria, file the proper paperwork, then you are the legitimate, if you will, migrant. If, however, you're trying to enter the country without a proper authorization, then you're an irregular migrant, you're sort of an offense to the state's sovereignty. Correspondingly, you are not only undesirable, but also dangerous. So this is one part of the discourse. In relation to asylum seekers, international law says that they should not be penalized, even if they enter without authorization, because there can be a range of very, very significant reasons why they cannot enter legitimately, including also because states are controlling their borders and because they don't want to admit refugees in the first place. But so generally speaking, the fact that an asylum seeker entered without authorization should not be used against them when they make the refugee claim. The reality is not always such. And often in political discourse, there is a conflation of these, of the situation of asylum seekers and those who are just considered irregular migrants, who are not necessarily making a refugee claim, not necessarily fleeing for their lives, but just trying to get to a state where they would have more opportunities. So in cases when this discourse gets conflated, then obviously this also results in a much stronger pushback against asylum seekers as well. So, I mean, I'm not really sure I can truly address the question. Yes, sure, there should be a common policy that, facilitates movement and recognizes these various reasons why individuals move. But unfortunately, we haven't gotten to that point yet. And I think these quite damaging discourses in terms of determining the sort of validity of a person's claim or the validity of their movement is truly just based on whether they can meet criteria for admission or not. And many people can't, just because of their socioeconomic status, because of the lack of language abilities, and so on and so forth. So even if we think about Canada, if you don't have the resources and the desirable characteristics, unfortunately, you cannot make it. Just the fact that you're willing to work hard and do your best is no longer sufficient. So I think I'll leave it at that, because there's definitely, it's a whole, topic for a whole seminar, I think.
No, but just really quickly follow up on this conflict. The humanitarian refugee flow has had a very pronounced gender component. Women and children basically are leaving, right? And whereas the men have not, in most cases, are turned around. They're not permitted to leave. I think it's between 16 and 60, if I'm not mistaken. I know Alina's here. Yes, she's not in her head. Okay, thank you. So do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, that's I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this. And someone was asking a question about the trans gender community as well, and what impact this might have there.
Well, I mean, I think there is always a gender dimension to migration generally, not just in this context, but of course, because of the prohibition, for men of military age to leave the country. Yes, that certainly has kind of exacerbated this, gender dimension of the movement, for sure. It also exacerbated the vulnerability of individuals, those who choose to cross, or made it much more difficult for families to decide whether to stay or to get separated. So this is another yet sort of impossible decision to make in that context, especially keeping in mind that it seems even in Western regions, it's also becoming less safe. So I think it really kind of compounded concern. I saw that question in relation to trans individuals. To be honest, I don't have any, I think it's an excellent question. I don't think there is any, indication from Canadian government in terms of whether they have even considered that issue. It certainly is a major concern. And I already know sort of there are news reports in terms of individuals being trapped precisely because their documentation does not actually accord to the fact that they have transitioned. The Canadian government will certainly require documentation. That's without a question. And I mean, at this point, I do doubt that they have considered that, the trans dimension of this. I don't think I can really say more than that. It certainly is a matter of concern, something that should be addressed, but I don't think anything has been sort of done at this moment.
Thank you. Natalie, did you want to add something?
I was just going to add that the gender dimension of this refugee flow, as Dr. Bagley well knows, is something that was mirrored in the 2015 refugee crisis, where it was a highly male-dominated outflow of migrants from the Middle East. I think these gender dimensions of particular refugee crises, vary, and it's just striking in this occasion, again, because we have these images of children alone with mothers, heavily pregnant women.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so we had a question which maybe I'll skip ahead to this one. This is from a Professor Merlis, who's also at our faculty, and he's thanking the panelists, but he's wondering how this war could end. What future end of war scenario is most likely given the circumstances? I don't know if anyone wants to offer thoughts on that. No one has the answer. We're well aware, but would anyone like to offer some thoughts on that? Scott, I think we decided that sanctions aren't going to do it alone, but would you like to?
Well, sanctions will definitely put pressure on the Russian state, especially, as you mentioned, Peter, as the war progresses and the sanctions grip. That will, the collapse of the Russian economy will put increasing pressure on the Russian state to act. The Russian central bank and the government has been quite creative in attempting to counterbalance the sanctions by essentially, nationalizing the balance sheets or the foreign currency holdings of corporations. 80% of corporate foreign currency holdings have to be basically submitted to the central bank. This will, stall a little bit the economic collapse, but will only stall it. So I do think the sanctions will put increasing pressure, certainly, on the Russian government. I mean, my view, I guess, and I, like many of you, have been scrambling since the war erupted to read on this issue and to figure out what exactly is going on, and have been thinking hard about these issues. It strikes me that one of the possible solutions to this, or one of the ways this gets resolved, is Ukrainian neutrality. Some type of agreement on Ukrainian neutrality that is neither a pro-Russian or a pro-West agreement. It strikes me that that is probably the most obvious geopolitical solution to the war. Now, of course, the terms of that is very important. As we know, the Minsk agreements would have the forms of decentralized governance and the incorporation of the Donbass region into the central government would have likely had the effect of kind of slowly destroying Ukraine from the inside. So the terms of neutrality would be very important. But as one of my colleagues has mentioned, in many senses, neutrality is the golden bridge between the two imperial superpowers that are in some respects involved in this. So I think that's one possible option. I think there are others, but it strikes me that that might be one of the leading possibilities, at least from my cursory reading of what's out there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We can't possibly get to all the questions in the chat. I do appreciate the ones that are there, of course. I think one question that does come up just very quickly regarding sanctions, I think this is fairly easily answered, but there is a difference between the sanctions that we're seeing now and the way Putin is claiming, for example, the USSR survived sanction-like conditions throughout its existence. But I think this is quite different. I mean, the level of unification, I guess we'll use that word loosely, but against what Russia has done is really unprecedented, and not just inside NATO. Although we still do have countries that are remaining somewhat neutral on this, probably hedging their bets in terms of resources and other issues. The Chinese question is particularly important. Someone did raise that as well in terms of what's China's role in this. I don't know if anyone would like to comment on that. Natalie, please.
Maybe very briefly, I'm sure everyone's familiar with the agreement that was signed between Russia and China just prior to the beginning of the Beijing Olympics, in which China pledged that its commitment to the agreement knew no limits, I think is the translation. And the Chinese government has been very brief and very careful in its statements at the United Nations so far, regretting the loss of life, hoping that the rules of international law will be followed, and that the hostilities will end as soon as possible, but affirming its concern that that natural security concerns be taken into account in any solution that's found. I'm paraphrasing there, but the reason that I raise this is because of Scott's very brave answer to that question about what might bring about an end to this conflict. And he ended with a discussion about Ukrainian neutrality. That, of course, appears to be, if to the extent that one can read the Chinese government's very careful statements, that would appear to be the Chinese government's preference in this situation. And of course, Ukrainian neutrality is something that this is not a new idea. I'm not advocating it, but I'm mentioning that if we think back to the Budapest Memorandum that was agreed in the very frightening period following the fall of the Iron Curtain and the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, when Ukraine had on its territory 5,000 nuclear weapons, and there was an effort to try to think of what to do about Russian concerns about the proximity of Ukrainian nuclear weapons when Ukraine was becoming an independent country. And so this Budapest Memorandum was signed in order to try to secure those weapons, which Ukraine voluntarily gave up. And part of that agreement, which had 5 points and the status of which is unclear in international law, it seems to meet the requirements of a treaty as far as I can tell, but it is denied treaty status verbally by the United States, that there were security assurances given to Ukraine and a commitment never to use military force on Ukrainian territory was part of that agreement. But the Russian perspective, as I understand it, is that at that time, part of the understanding was that Ukraine had committed to neutrality, and that its 2013 effort to try to develop a closer relationship with the EU threatened to violate that Budapest Memorandum. So back to China. China, as we all know, has a unique relationship with Taiwan, where the former government of mainland China fled to Taiwan, retreated to Taiwan, the island of Formosa, back in the 1930s, and became a separate, I think I've got the year right, or the decade right, and the Republic of China, located on Taiwan, continued to claim that it was the government of all of China, while the People's Republic of China on mainland China claimed that it was the rightful government of Taiwan. And so that situation has continued for the decades since and led to the swapping of seats. The mainland China now occupies China's seat in the Security Council. Taiwan used to occupy it until the 1970s, when the United States decided to pull its chips and support mainland China instead. So China's very interested in asserting the idea that an entity that it regards as part of its territorial integrity and security should be included, that it should somehow have protection against any kind of international criticism or intervention if it reclaims that entity. South China Sea, I won't mention. Sorry to go on.
No, it's okay, and let's not forget, of course, the resources that are flowing from Russia into China. I mean, that's, many would argue that's what keeps the Chinese economy, part of what keeps the Russian economy alive in the first place. So it's going to be tremendous to see what happens there.
If I can add one point, Peter, just, and it's a very quick one on China. I think it's very important also to note that so far, China's banks have basically refused financial deals with Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And if that continues, the pressure that will put on the Russian state and the Russian economy will be immense. So we'll see, of course. Yeah.
Although I would add, a lot of what goes on between China and Russia is illicit trade as well, and specifically in the forestry sector. But that's another issue. Okay, so look, we are out of time. I really appreciate the questions in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but I'd like to thank my panelists for coming here today and having this discussion with us. It was an interesting discussion. We've only just scratched the surface, of course, and we'll all watch these events unfold and do what we can, I think, I hope to contribute to ease the pain. But thank you very much, panelists, and thank you all to the audience for attending today. And be safe. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks to you, and thanks to everybody.